I am Kathy Hart. I am the Senior Curator of Collections and also the Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming here at the Hood. And good morning. Welcome to this series of talks that will allow us to delve more deeply into Poseidon's realm. First, some information on today's session. We expect the symposium will end at 12:30, not at noon, as previously listed, so please take note. Please turn off your cell phones if you have not already. Thank you. The first session this morning will be introduced by Ada Cohen, Professor of Art History, and the Israel Evans Professor in Oratory and Belles Lettres. There will also be an opportunity for questions about both talks afterwards. There will be a 10-minute break following the questions, and then Julie Ruby, Assistant Professor of Classics, will introduce the next two speakers with a Q&A session following. I would like to thank Seth Pevnick for laying the groundwork for today's discussion in his stimulating lecture last night, and for curating such a wonderful show on the subject of Poseidon and the sea. So thank you, Seth. I would also like to acknowledge Sharon Reed, who organized all the details of the opening last night and today's symposium. Thank you very much, Sharon. It's a very time-consuming and logistically complicated thing to do. I'm also very grateful to my colleagues in art history and classics for their help on organizing and suggesting the speakers, along with Seth Pevnick. Lastly, we would have been unable to do this, all of this, without the support of Claire Forrester and Dan Bernstein, who's on our Board of Overseers. Our deep appreciation to them for their ongoing support of our mission here at the museum. On a personal note, it is very gratifying to have an exhibition on the art of the ancient Mediterranean once more again here at the Hood. The Hood has organized two important exhibitions of ancient Greek art. The first in 1992, Goddess and Polis, the Panathenaic Festival in Ancient Athens. And then 11 years later, with Coming of Age in Ancient Greece, Images of Childhood from the Classical Past in 2003, with Jenifer Niles, our first speaker, as the driving force for both. In 2010-2012, we borrowed ancient Greek and Roman works from Yale University Art Gallery in an initiative supported by the Mellon Foundation about collection sharing. Now, in 2015, we are thrilled to have this exhibition organized by Dartmouth graduate and former Hood intern Seth Pevnick. Without further ado, I will hand over the proceedings to Ada Cohen. Thank you, Ada.
Good morning. Can you hear me? It is a pleasure to introduce this morning two very accomplished women. Unfortunately, one in absentia due to the flu, Professors Jenifer Niles and Margaret Miles, who have demonstrated their expertise in art history, museum studies, archaeology, as well as administration. I do not know whether this multifaceted engagement with the field speaks directly to their graduate training, but it is interesting to note that both received their PhD in the same year and from the same Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. So it is appropriate that Professor Niles, who is the woman sitting there, will be the one to read Professor Miles's paper to us in her absence, and that is after she delivers her own paper. Jenifer Niles is the Elsie B. Smith Professor in the Liberal Arts at Case Western Reserve University. She's also the chair of the Managing Committee of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. She has excavated at several sites in Italy and Greece and is the recipient of many honors and fellowships. Those of you in the audience who have been in Hanover for a long time are likely to remember Professor Niles, and those of you who are not, you already heard from Kathy, that she was associated with, she has had this long-standing relationship with the Hood Museum, where she curated not only one, but two landmark exhibitions, which I will repeat. First, in 1992, Goddess and Polis, the Panathenaic Festival in ancient Athens, and later in 2003, Coming of Age in Ancient Greece, Images of Childhood from the Classical Past, which she brought to us together with her colleague, John Oakley. And some of us in the Art History Department and the Classics Department utilized these exhibitions repeatedly for our classes. The exhibition catalogs also broke new ground in classical studies and further expanded Jenifer's reputation as a versatile scholar with wide-ranging interests. She's an expert on the Athenian Parthenon, on which she has produced 3 books, and on matters of myth and gender. Her most recent book, Women in the Ancient World, was published in 2011 by the British Museum Press and has already enjoyed 2 German editions. If her many books and innumerable articles on just about any topic in Greek art were to be lined up, they would take up a long portion of your bookshelves. Today, she will speak on the voyage out, fish in Attic vase painting. Jenifer will then channel Margaret Miles and will take us from small fish to grand expanses of space. Currently professor of art history and classics at the University of California at Irvine, Professor Miles recently completed a 6-year Mellon professorship at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, where she shaped the curriculum on all matters academic. Her scholarship has focused primarily on architectural topics. Having drawn, measured, and written about an impressive number of ancient temples, both in Greece and Sicily, she has intimate knowledge of the archaeological landscape. She has 2 books forthcoming on Greek architecture and has written many scholarly articles. Her expertise goes beyond Mediterranean architecture to include an edited volume on Cleopatra, as well as the book Art as Plunder, The Ancient Origins of Debate About Cultural Property, which focused on Roman plunder, but also explored a wide range of other historical issues, some of them still ongoing, and raised broader questions that you will recognize as extremely timely. Today's lecture returns to matters of space and is titled Templed Promontories, Visibility at Sea in Poseidon's Aegean. Please join me in welcoming Jenifer Niles back to Dartmouth for a series of 2 back-to-back lectures. Thank you.
Okay, this is the Niles and Miles Dog and Pony Show, or maybe I should say the Tuna and Dolphin Show. SeaWorld. Okay, we're going to SeaWorld. All right, great. I want to also thank Seth for this spectacular show upstairs, which I already enjoyed and hope to go back to see more of it, and for this excuse to come back to Dartmouth, where, as you know, I've had many years of wonderful collaborations with the Hood, and particularly with Kathy Hart, who really, it's been one of the high points of my professional career, I have to say, is working on these 2 shows at Dartmouth. So I'm delighted to be back here. Now, my talk today is called The Voyage Out, and in this I will try to explore the meaning of fish in Athenian vase painting. They are not all that common, which is surprising for people who live on and by the sea. We know they savored great fish in their meals, and of course, so it was an elemental part of their lives, and yet there are very few representations, and I'm going to show you all of them, of fishing, catching fish, butchering fish, and then in the role of fish in some mythological scenes. Of course, do we need to lower the lights a little bit, or is this okay for everyone? maybe down a little, okay. Because I want these beautiful vases to show up. Just a tad, okay, thanks. Is that better? Too dark? Okay, great. Of course, fish are an attribute of the great god Poseidon, who is featured upstairs in the exhibition. I just show you two nice examples, one of which is in the show on the upper left where he's holding a dolphin, and in the other one on the lower right, a tuna. And these are the big fish, mammal land fish, of course, of the Aegean, and frequently appear as his attribute. And that's not surprising, of course, for the god of the sea. Now, many of you know, as many of you know, I am kind of obsessed with the Parthenon. But what many of you may not know is that there are actually some fish carved on the Parthenon. And so I got interested in fish through my work on this great temple. And they appear on this northernmost metope on the east facade of the Parthenon. It's E14, which shows Helios rising out of the water. And here's a beautiful drawing of it by Kathy Schwab of Fairfield University, who's worked on these metopes. And I think you can see, let's see, do I have a, yeah, right down here, that there are two fish in the spokes, behind the spokes of the wheels of the sun god's chariot as he rises out of the water. Now, most people would think, of course, that there's also a water bird, if we have any ornithologists among us here. Okay. So it's always been thought that this fish represents just the sea, that he's coming out of the sea. And what I would like to try to prove in this paper is that fish aren't just about the sea, they're about the voyage on the sea, as we see Helios coming out. And here, just to show you these in detail, if you're interested in ichthyology, these are gray mullets, and which was called a just fish because it didn't eat other fish. It was a vegetarian. Anyway, so these charming little fish shown here. So why fish? Well, of course, here's an example of a vase which does, in fact, show Helios traveling over the sea, and you can see these fish depicted in the water underneath. That's fairly common, but I would like to, you can see, as you see here on this vase, it's Heracles sitting on a rock at the left, and Helios. Heracles seems to have shot his arrows at Helios, but anyway. The artist could draw waves to indicate the sea. And so it's my contention that these fish are here to indicate a voyage on the sea, over the sea, motion, in other words, as they swim to the left. And this appears in a similar fashion on other scenes of motion. For instance, a horseman riding to the right, as you see there, in the upper left, with a bird flying by. This is not to indicate the sky. This is to indicate the forward motion of the horse. Likewise, the charioteers on the lower right, we don't know of dogs who ran in chariot races, so this dog is there to represent swift forward motion of the horses. And I would contend that fish are the same. Now, fish were quite popular, just to go back and show you some earlier images of fish in Greek art. We go all the way back to the Bronze Age with this lovely boy who's had quite a phenomenal catch here on a fresco from Thera, ancient Thera. And of course, Minoan vases from Crete are filled with marine life. These are island societies very closely associated with the sea, and they use these marine motifs very extensively in their art. Some city-states, with ceramic traditions like Sparta, also had fish on their vases, and I show you 3 cups here with, well, at least 2 of them have lots of fish on them. These were produced in ancient Sparta, and they were exported to southern Italy, as many of these vases that you'll see happen to have turned up. Of course, many Greek vases are found in the Greek colonies of southern Italy and Sicily, but as we know from later Greek art, there was sort of an obsession with fish in the gastronomy of Greece, and particularly in southern Italy, as I'll show you in a minute. I also show you a coin from Sicily, from the site of Zankle, which has a harbor. It's a town with a very circular harbor, and here is a dolphin in the harbor. I know the dolphins are mammals, but anyway, just to show you this interest in fish in the West. Another example is this really charming Kyretan hydria. I can't resist showing it to you with a seal on it, and it's an incredible. We have a sea monster. This is Heracles killing a sea monster, but I want to feature this adorable little seal pup up here, which is so realistic. And it also appears on the coins of Phocis, and Phocis was a city in East Greece, which the name of which means seal. So this is sort of a canting device on their coinage. And then an artist from this area presumably migrated to Italy and produced this vase, which was found in Etruria, which shows a fairly naturalistic scene of fish life. So these are not Athenian vases that I'm showing you, and to show you how other Greeks were interested in marine life. The first fish plate, and you'll see a number of these upstairs in the exhibition. This is this pretty spectacular one from Chicago, which is actually produced in Athens, although the majority of these were produced in southern Italy and Sicily. It's a wonderful example. The Greeks didn't use plates when they ate. They mostly ate stewed meats in bowls, and so this was a very specialty item to have a plate with that indentation in the middle, as Seth told us, for the sauce. Presumably not tartar sauce, but some kind of sauce, and then the fish. And these have been found in graves in southern Italy and with fish bones on them. So we know that they were actually used as fish plates here. Some example, particularly beautiful one in Cleveland on the upper right, fish plate from Paestum, and another Paestum vase that shows a whole variety, to show you these were not just on fish plates, a whole variety of sea creatures below this image of the sea monster Scylla. Okay. Now, there were dedications as well. We have inscriptional evidence for the importance of fish in ancient Greece. And the best known instance is recorded by Pausanias, who saw at Delphi a statue of a bull. And this was a dedication by the people of Corfu, the island again, who had a massive school of tuna go by, they were alerted to it by the bellowing of a bull at the seashore. And they were unable to catch it. So they sent an embassy to, as people did in those days, to the Delphic oracle to say, how can we possibly catch this school of tuna? I would imagine they would have swam by that point. But anyway, they did get an answer, and they were told to sacrifice the bull. So they came back, sacrificed the bull, they caught this huge amount of fish, and then dedicated a rather expensive bronze statue at Delphi and at Olympia, and the base is preserved at Delphi. So it shows how profitable the haul of a big school of tuna would be for the Greeks. A much smaller, more modest votive offering is this little miniature bronze tuna that was found at a sanctuary of Apollo at Sparta, the Amyclyon. It's inscribed to Poseidon, POSOIDANOS, it says right on it. It's been identified by Ephraim Lytle as a giant bluefin tuna. And we know from Athenaeus, from another ancient author, that there was a tuna sacrifice, kind of an annual tuna sacrifice called the Thenaion, in which you would offer your first tuna. I mean, normally the Greeks did not sacrifice fish. They sacrificed, animals to the gods, but this was an unusual sacrifice of a large tuna, or the first catch to Poseidon. And in Athens, we do have some inscriptions about dedications to Poseidon that involve fish. There's a marble pillar from the Acropolis for a statue of a young girl. We don't know if it was bronze or marble, but the inscription reads that it was a dedication from the first fruits of a catch, which is the sea ruler, i.e. Poseidon, with the golden trident provided to Naulacus. And then there's an inscribed altar which seemed to have been dedicated by two fishermen who caught some swordfish had a lucky day out the water catching swordfish. Okay, now let's turn to the vases that show some scenes of fishing, dealing with fish. We have this is not Attic, but it's Corinthian, and it shows our first and really only representation of a fish net. There are probably two boys unrolling or rolling up a fish net. This is from the site of Corinth, which was, of course, on the sea. The initial publication thought these dangling weights on the ropes were not fish nets, but it has been identified as something called the amphiblestron, which was a net actually mentioned by Homer. Now, there are only 4 fishing scenes on Athenian vases that I know of anyway, and 2 of them are mythological, these 2. You see on the right we have a satyr sitting on a rock who's caught a fish. Heracles here in a similar pose. This is not, you can see this today in Greece, people sitting on rocky promontories catching fish. Now, Heracles is, he is accompanied, I might add, by Poseidon on the left up there and Hermes on the right. So presumably Poseidon's going to bring him luck in his fishing expedition. The most, I went the wrong way. Well-known fishing scene is this charming scene, very realistic scene on a cup in Boston that shows a young boy with his rod and also his net leaning over, again, on a rocky promontory. There are a couple fish below. He's caught one, of course, and a shy octopus behind the rock. And on the floor of the bay here is a fish net, which is still used today. The Greek term is the kurtos. And so he's both fishing and with a rod and with a net. Now, this vase also was found in Etruria, I might add. It was found in Italy. And if any of you know the Etruscan painting of hunting and fishing, you can see why this might have been a popular export. Then we have a more humorous vase by the Pan painter. Here's my purloined image. I couldn't get this. This is in Vienna. But you see, again, a fisherman on a rock, and this is sort of a joke because the fish are just rushing to be caught by him. He holds a basket, and his partner there has a net. On the other side of the vase, we see 2 baskets on a pole with a boy running, similar cap on his head, rushing off. I'd like to think he's rushing to the agora to get the fish there early in the morning. The bell rang in the agora to summon people to the fish market in the morning. So, and you wanted to get them there fresh. So and I want to say these weird hats, this looks like something you'd wear in Vermont, in New Hampshire in the winter, but this is a sign of a Banausik or a low-class workman's hat in Greek art. So these are not people who are making a lot of money by fishing. Here's another scene of a boy with baskets, which has been interpreted in all sorts of ways other than as fishing baskets, but I'd like to think that he is a fisherman because those baskets are very similar to what we've seen before, to what we see carried by the old fishermen in Roman art, and also on the mosaic upstairs, the Roman mosaic that Seth showed last night. There's a very similar kind of basket like this. So this rustic type boy is probably bringing fish to the market. Then we have scenes of butchering, and this particular vase is in the show, so I won't go on about it, but you see a large tuna being carried, and on the other side of the vase at the top, you see the butchering of the fish going on. So these are scenes set in the market, presumably, and would have been readily available to Greek ceramicists whose potter's quarters were situated right near the ancient marketplace. So they would have seen scenes like this more than they would have seen scenes of fishing, presumably. This is another black figure vase that shows a huge tuna about to be chopped up, the dogs waiting to get the innards probably down below. and a trough for the blood. And again, these are sort of lower class workmen, butchers, as we can tell by their garments. Now, the most often shown scene is this great vase in the upper left, which is actually made in Sicily and from Sicily. It's not Athenian. And it, again, is a older man butchering a fish. And what I want you to particularly note here, this isn't just a scene of butchering, it's a scene of commerce, because this other old man, who looks like a comic actor, has a coin in his hand. So he's coming to buy the fish. And we do know that fish was very expensive. It was a very prized commodity because, of course, it didn't stay fresh that long. You had to rush it to market, no refrigeration. And the catches were sporadic. You couldn't really live on the sea. Another South Italian vase shows a satyr, for some reason, about to, again, chop up this fish while this woman pours water on it. And there were actually legal prohibitions against putting water on the fish in the market because it made it look fresher than it actually was. So you really weren't supposed to do that. So I think, again, this is sort of a comic scene. Now, oops. Oh, there's a tuna for you in case you need what a tuna looks like. Okay. Now, one vase I'd like to add to the mix, which no one has really considered in this context before, is a peculiar oil flask that's at Harvard. And it was published as a man with a snake, an old woman with a oil flask in her hand. But what I would like to propose is that this is the sale of what was considered a great luxury item in Athens, and that was the Copaic eel. North of Athens, there was a large inland waterway with eels in it, and these were harvested and brought to Athens and sold for a pretty penny. And I think what this woman has done is sort of made a good deal. She's holding a coin in her hand. He's looking a little doubtful about this purchase, and it's not a ribbon or a snake, but it's probably an eel. And I wonder if this box here doesn't have more eels in it, and she's sort of standing on it to keep it shut. But this is the fishwife, I believe, the original fishwife. And it's telling that it's a woman selling it because in the comic poets, eels are often compared to women. One author says, Boeotian eels, goddesses with white fair bodies. Another passage says the Boeotian virgin of the Copaic lake in reference to an eel. And in Aristophanes, there are many passages in which the Copaic eel is a woman. She's the hetaira next door, or the bride, or the goddess. So I think we could add this to the repertoire of scenes of fish for sale, marine creatures for sale. Now let's look at images of traveling over the sea, and I'm going to omit dolphins and octopus because they're pretty common in Attic vase painting, and just look at scenes of, as I say, other kinds of fish. And they start in the late geometric period. This jug is very famous because it shows a shipwreck, and there are 11 men floating around in the water, and there are 11 fish. Only one surviving figure on the overturned keel here, and everyone else swimming around. This has been thought to represent the lone survivor, namely Odysseus, in the Odyssey, but it could be any disaster at sea. Homer refers to the sea as man-eating, and there are many passages in the Iliad in which reference is made to corpses being consumed by fish. And this particular action is pictorialized on another vase, again, this one from South Italy, from Pithecusae, where one man seems to have lost his head, another his arm. You can make these out here. And a third is in the process. This is being eaten by this, presumably, maybe a shark. Now, these geometric artists were perfectly capable of showing drowning men, but they're clearly more concerned here with depicting the hazards of travel by sea, the hazards posed by hungry fish. When we move down to the 6th century, we get sea monsters that are slain by heroes. You already saw Heracles and the sea monster. Here's another version. This is Perseus slaying the sea monster with Andromeda over here. This actually isn't so much a sea monster. This is Heracles at Troy rescuing Hermione from some creature who looks like a fossil head coming out of the rock. It's been identified as a giraffe skull. I think it's more like a moray eel enlarged, but at any rate, there were many, many sea monsters that proliferated in the 6th century. Now, moving a little farther along to the end of the 6th century, we have two interesting vases that haven't been interpreted very successfully. But I think if you look at this, we have a ship, we have fish in the sea, and we have a boy who's about to jump overboard. This has sometimes been thought to be Protesilaus, the first Greek hero who landed at Troy. We'll hear more about him in the next lecture. But I think you can see that it looks to me like he's being shoved overboard. I mean, he's walking the plank, so to speak, and being tossed into the sea, perhaps as some form of punishment. And that interpretation might be supported by another vase, which is in Athens. It's not in great shape, so I'm going to show you a drawing of it. Again, it's a ship. Here's a boy tied to the prow of the ship. The stern. And this figure being thrown overboard. There are fish, again, down here. And this figure who's tied, and he's presumably under the keel of the ship. I think the term for this is keeling. It's a form of punishment that was used for sailors to tie them, I guess waterboarding of antiquity or something. I don't know. Anyway, so these scenes, and I'm showing you there are not any other ship scenes in Greek art, show, again, different kinds of dangers of going out to sea. Now, there are more benign scenes, such as gods who float around on magical vessels, like Apollo here in his winged tripod going over the sea. Again, we have the sea creatures below, as I would suggest, not really necessary here, but suggesting a voyage. Likewise with Heracles in the bowl of the sun, with the marine creatures underneath. Of course, Odysseus himself is the great seafarer, and this this is not, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. This is actually the ghost of Achilles here on a ship, again, a sea voyage. Ships are hard to show on vases because they're long and narrow, so we just get the front of it here, but this is the ghost of Achilles going over to the Black Sea. But here's one you'll be more familiar with. This is Odysseus. His name is inscribed. He's racing across the sea on a kind of pontoon boat made of amphoras. We have the fish and we have the waves. Again, I think the fish indicate the voyage, but we also have another danger of the sea, which is the north wind. So here's Boreas, the wind god, blowing Odysseus over the sea. Okay. Finally, just last one, the hero Theseus actually dives into the sea, which is a very uncharacteristic Greek action because they feared death by drowning. They would not have a proper burial. They would be eaten by those man-eating fish. But here he is. He goes down to the underworld kingdom of Amphitrite, the wife of Poseidon. He's carried by a triton, and we have dolphins around him. So by the 5th century, the sea becomes a little more benign. Maybe this is as a result of their increased abilities at navigations and also their Athenians' great victory at Salamis and their newfound love of the sea. Here's Theseus, again, down at that underworld kingdom, and you can see Poseidon welcoming him. Europa travels over the sea. We get down now into the 4th century, and again we have, this is a major sea voyage. to Crete, and we get these fish in the sea. Now, just back to the metope where I started, I have tried to prove that that's why these fish are here, that we're talking about a major voyage. He's actually coming, not just the rising sun, but he's actually coming to the battlefield to help Hephaestus, who's in the next metope off the battlefield. But I found a wonderful quote by Marshall that talks about the great art of Phidias. And he says, do you see the fish precisely carved by Phidian art? Add water, they will swim. Okay, so that's a kind of an overview of fish in Greek vase painting. I hope I've tried to prove that point about voyages, but I want to add one other item to the mix. And it's on this, I'm going to skip that, on this odd little cup in Rome where we see a dolphin, another fish, probably a dolphin, who's actually playing music with the aulos, the double pipes. And in fact, the word aulos was the name for the blowholes on mammal fish who spouted air out. So it's a kind of a clever trick. And then there's a third fish down here, which has been referred to as another dolphin, 3 dolphins. That's what everyone has said who's published this cup. However, if you look more closely at this fish, you see that it is not a dolphin. It is a new species, as yet identified, the phallus fish. And of course, the phallus has an eye on it, let me say that only the Greeks would invent the phallus fish, because they have phallus birds, phallus horses, and all sorts of phalli all over their art. So the phallus fish is nothing to be surprised at. The eye, of course, is shown on ships, so you can navigate see where you're going. Likewise, the phallus needs to know where it's going, so it often has an eye on the end of it, as shown in this one carried by the woman. So I end my talk here with this new species, which I'm sorry Seth doesn't have in the show, but another time. Where this particular marine creature is going, I will leave to your imagination. Thank you. I'll just give you an overview. This is what she's concerned with, is why certain temples of Poseidon are placed where they are around the Aegean. And I think she makes a very good case for their particular locations. Here is the picture of Sunion, which you see upstairs, which is the most famous and best preserved temple of Poseidon, but we'll hear about some others today. So, the placement of sanctuaries alongside or near difficult sea routes in the Aegean offers a fresh perspective on the locations of Greek sanctuaries. Why were Greek temples built where they were? The reasons may not be recoverable, unless we are told by ancient authors, but it is the intersection of numinosity and utility that I think needs further exploration. Specialists in the Bronze Age have been at the forefront in pioneering considerations of routes, exchange, theories, and debates about minimalist, elite-only trade versus full-fledged merchant networks. Further recent work has been published on the Mediterranean sea routes, the grain trade, and regional economies, most notably Constantinople, I can't pronounce this, The Dance of the Islands, Rudischauer's Athens and the Cyclades, and Cyprian Brookbank's monumental The Making of the Middle Sea. While I acknowledge the power of economics in antiquity, certainly from the vantage of our own economy-driven age, my interest is how sanctuaries, shrines, and memorials were founded and maintained alongside the expansion of maritime commerce. The two networks, religious and practical, have a considerable and natural overlap. The network of sanctuaries of Poseidon had multiple aspects, both restricting and replenishing. They were the ineluctable jives of violent seas and winds, the force of sudden squalls, lurking monsters of the deep. But Poseidon's sanctuaries famously offered asylum to refugees, and calm seas and mild winds permitted rapid travel of long distances. Sea routes offered the potential for enormous profit through trade or seasonal tuna hunts. Sea travel was a risk worth taking. We begin with proper acknowledgement of Poseidon's land-based reputation as the master of earthquakes, of horses, the father by countless nymphs and nereids, of numerous Echistae, these are the founders of Greek colonies, and eponymous heroes. As urban dwellers ourselves, we need to keep in mind that the modern bifurcation between land and sea was not then so accurate. Impiety against Poseidon caused many trials for Odysseus, and we need only to recall them for a catalog of the dangers of the seas: squalls, huge waves, shipwrecks, monsters, elements in the landscape that move unexpectedly, whirlpools and rocks, cannibalistic natives, sorcerers, and perhaps the most perilous of all, the temptations of Lotus Land. If that is not a state of mind, but a real place, I assure you it is not in California, but somewhere in the Mediterranean. In this late geometric oinakoi, which you've just seen, the one on the right there, and a spouted vessel from Pithecusae on the left, we see illustrated scenes of shipwreck and disaster. Jeffrey Hurwitz has argued persuasively in a recent article that we should read these scenes as narratives, that even though the vase may not represent the Odyssey, it surely represents an Odyssey. Odysseus is the sea traveler par excellence, but he represents many generations of travelers. Sea routes came into existence as a result of accumulated sad experience, yet a certain degree of predictability made them possible. Many voyages in the Odyssey take place at night, and navigation by stars was essential, since compasses were not yet known. Although there is evidence for magnetite or lodestone, stones that might have been more than just curiosities. The earliest preserved periplus, which is sort of a ship's log, with sailing directions by Pseudo-Silax, is now dated to the 4th century, but surely, BC, I should say, but surely even earlier ones existed. Evidence for sea routes is provided by ancient authors' testimonia, by shipwrecks, and perhaps by the pattern of temples and shrines on headlands that served as markers. But the Mediterranean itself offers other predictive clues. As a sea, not an ocean, there are few tides, for they occur only in certain partially enclosed spaces, such as the Euripus Canal, which she's got this map oriented on purpose from west to east, and the Euripus is in here somewhere, and near Kylixes. There's kind of a whirlpool there, and we're told that it puzzled the elderly Aristotle so much that he leapt to his death there. And the currents from the Atlantic enter in the Straits of Gibraltar, which is down here, and circulate counterclockwise. They are usually not particularly strong, except when the land masses serve to channel them and reinforce their power. The tuna follow them inward, eventually up into the Black Sea, at least in antiquity, when they were so numerous. Here's the Black Sea, so the tuna are coming all the way through here, when you could actually grab them by hand in some places. But it was neither tides nor currents that caused such dangers at sea. Rather, the winds, above all, in combination with landforms and currents, made the sea perilous. Within the Aegean, 4 places stand out. Herodotus narrates the disastrous loss of Darius, King Darius of Persia's fleet up here at Mount Athos, and Xerxes' response a few years later. He punished the landscape itself by digging a wide canal through the Acti Peninsula, which is still visible today from Google Earth. Although those episodes in the Persian Wars are best known, Mount Athos consistently made sailors beware of the sea. One of the earliest lighthouses to be excavated, a 6th century circular tower with dedicatory inscriptions, was found on the east side of the island of Thasos, which is up here. And 2 others facing the same direction are known on Thasos. Despite the canal through the Athos Peninsula, or perhaps because of it, Xerxes' fleet came to doom against the north coast of Euboea, which is up here. I guess it's that one, yeah. A third dangerous place, still highlighted in contemporary sailing directions as a very difficult passage for yachts and small boats, is the Douro between Andros and Euboea, the Douro Channel. The fourth place of danger is Cape Malea down here. And Tenairon is this site here. Okay. Where Jason, Odysseus, Menelaus, and countless others could be swept past the island of Kythera and Crete and onto the African coast. Building shrines and temples and even maintaining a few lighthouses was a long-term communal endeavor, for it was not just for the benefit of locals, but rather for any traveler. The overall pattern of templed promontories was investigated long ago by Ellen Churchill Semple. In her article of 1927, she presents two maps of her findings based on her reading of the literary testimonia. She found, this is the first map, she found some 175 temples, shrines, and altars noted by ancient authors around the Mediterranean. She read both Greek and Latin authors for this map, and so a wide chronological range is represented. For the Aegean, this more detailed view outlines the points of intersection of the numinous sea landscape with its perils. I would like to look more closely at a small subset of these. First, the general pattern of currents from the Hellespont and the back swirl of the Atlantic are marked here, coming down from the northeast to the southwest and southeast. The currents bifurcate around the Cyclades and head south beyond Crete to the African coast. Then, closer to Athens, we add in the prevailing summertime winds, especially fierce during the Meltemi in July. If you've ever been sailing, and you know what that's like in the Aegean at the wrong time of year. Here, the presence of Poseidon has been invoked at several spots. People didn't go to Mount Olympus to see the gods or ask them for something. Rather, they hoped, as we sometimes still do, that the gods will come to them. So the temple prepared a space for the gods' presence. And here we see it prepared, especially where Poseidon's control over unruly forces is needed, at Geristos, Sunion, Calauria, Tinos. Genealogy in mythography reflects this and made Geristos, Calauros, and Tenairos three brothers, although they were sons of Zeus, not Poseidon. Robert Schumacher argues that the association between Geristos and Calauros was part of an etiology for an archaic Calaurian amphictyony, or league, as is attested by ancient authors. The league included a number of cities, Hermione of Epidaurus, Aegina, Athens, Prysae, Nauplian, Minion, Orchomenos, and their envoys shared sacrifice to Poseidon at Calauria. The idea of such an early league has been challenged, but even if invented, the genealogy reflects a posited perceptual network. Because of the role of the winds in the Aegean maritime experience, it comes as no surprise that the Athenians should make Boreas, the north wind, their son-in-law, after he snatched up the Athenian princess Oreithyia. Here we see a statue from the Temple of the Athenians on Delos representing Boreas abducting or taking away Oreithyia. Aeschylus wrote a play about this, now lost, but Herodotus comments about the destruction of Xerxes' fleet at Artemision. Quote, "Now I cannot say if this was really why the Persians were caught at anchor by the storm wind, but the Athenians are quite positive that just as Boreas helped them before, so Boreas was responsible for what happened on this occasion also. And when they went home, they built the god a shrine by the river Ilissus." End quote. The Temple of Poseidon at Sunion is the best preserved and best known of the many temples dedicated to him. Rounding the promontory can be difficult for small boats even today. The temple marks the gateway into the Saronic Gulf and into Athenian waters. The winds are especially fierce around this temple. Note the weather-beaten fluting of the columns reflecting the atmospheric force. The deme of Sunion acquired a character much like other sanctuaries of Poseidon, and it served as a convenient place for Athenians to relocate difficult refugees, rebellious Aegianetans, and likely the Salaminioi, in other words, their enemies. The sanctuary of Poseidon at Calauria on Poros, which you see here, was also a place of political refuge, most famously for Demosthenes in 322 BC, when those opposed to Macedonian rule or control suffered reprisals. In Plutarch's account, Demosthenes retreated to the temple of Poseidon when cornered by the Macedonians sent by Antipater, and likely took poison to commit suicide. At the end, he managed to stagger out of the temple with an invocation to Poseidon so as not to pollute it with his death. The aura of neutrality of the sanctuary, which may have served for the Calaurian League much earlier, is reflected in its reception of particularly worrisome guests. The trajectory, force, and chronology of the Athenian Empire in the 5th century is under revision. All will agree, I think, that the connections with the northern Aegean and the Hellespont were crucial to Athenian shipping in the grain trade and in northern gold and silver mines. In order to venture out northward, the Athenian ships had to pass through the notorious Douro, that's between the channel between Euboea on the left and Andros, the island of Andros, on the right. The 5th edition of the Mediterranean Pilot, published in 1918, remarks, quote, "The navigation of the Douro Channel is one of the difficulties of the Levant, especially in sailing vessels, as the strong northerly winds, which prevail during the summer months, may be said scarcely to cease for upwards of 4 months of the year, from the beginning of May until the end of August, or middle of September. And after the autumnal equinox, although they are not so constant, they do not so constantly prevail, gales from that quarter are as heavy and frequent as from other points of the compass," end quote. The pilot warns further, quote, that the general current from the Dardanelles, which sets towards the western part of the archipelago, is much accelerated by the strong northerly or northeasterly winds and causes the stream of the Douro Channel to run with great strength. The sanctuary of Poseidon at Geristos offered 2 harbors, you can see them there, but facing different directions where boats could take refuge if they could not make it through this, treacherous channel. There are also 2 harbors at Sunion. The distance between Euboea and Andros is here about 6 miles, but the rocky shoreline of both islands contributes to the danger. Winds curl up on the coastline and flow back out over the strait. The sanctuary is first mentioned in the Odyssey, Book 3, as the place where Nestor, Diomedes, and Menelaus land after crossing the open sea and sacrifice bulls to Poseidon. The location of the sanctuary of Geristos was until recently uncertain, but the find of a Hellenistic inscription near Castri, the arrow is pointing to Castri there, preserving the crucial line that it was to be set up in the sanctuary, helps confirm what topographers had supposed from its prime location. The Athenians seem to have gotten control of the sanctuary at least by 470 BC, as it was so necessary for the grain trade. The same passageway toward Delos also offered difficulties of wind and currents. The cross winds around Delos, Rhenea, and Mykonos make for uncertain crossings even today with modern powered boats. So if you go to Delos, you should plan to spend some extra days in case you can't get across. By the 5th century BC, a sanctuary of Poseidon and Amphitrite was established on the island of Tinos. You see that there. The likely stopover for northern passages to Delos. Although the sanctuary's remains date mostly to the Delian resurgence at the end of the 4th century and 3rd century, the French excavators have found traces of an earlier sanctuary dating to the 5th. Here's the base of the temple of Poseidon and Amphitrite, and the sanctuary also had a very elaborate fountain house, a long double stoa built in the Hellenistic period. And there's a close correspondence between the fortunes of this sanctuary and that of Delos, the shrine of Apollo. Okay, now let's move up to the Hellespont, the crucial gateway to the Black Sea, so important for the Athenian grain supply. Its mouth was framed by pendant shrines that recalled the Trojan War. On the northern European side, or Thracian Chersonese, was the hero shrine of Protesilaus, the first Greek ashore at Troy. After he fought and killed 4 Trojans, he was the first Greek to be killed by Hector. He is one of 3 heroes cited by Pausanias, who were once men but received divine honors and had cities dedicated to them. Protesilaus' tomb at Elaeus on the Thracian Chersonese was said to have been planted with elms by mourning nymphs. The trees grew enormously tall, but when they were tall enough to see Troy, I don't have Troy on the map, but the upper crowns would wither. Arrian reports that Alexander sacrificed to Protesilaus at Elaeus before leaving the European side. On the opposite, Troad side of the Hellespont was Achilles' tomb, where the ashes of Patroclus were also deposited, and where Alexander made another sacrifice after he crossed the Hellespont. The waterway of the Hellespont itself is treated by Herodotus not just as an obvious border between Europe and Asia, which Darius and Xerxes should not have crossed, but as a divine spirit, offended along with Poseidon when Xerxes bridged it, then whipped, and even threw in red-hot iron fetters and commanded curses to be drawn upon it. The Hellespont is a difficult channel with a variegated topography. 2 layers of currents from the warmer Aegean rush into the channel and compete with 2 currents rushing out from the colder Black Sea. The currents run in layers and move around a jagged coastline, increasing their speed as they go. But again, it is primarily the winds that make the passage difficult. And Margie Miles knows this from personal experience because 2 summers ago she swam the Dardanelles and she won a medal in her class. I'm happy to say. The only downside was that the Turkish newspaper people weren't interviewing her about her win. They were interviewing Bo Derek, who also swam the Hellespont in the same race that year. Okay, and that's just an aside. Okay. The other end of the Propontis, or Sea of Marmara, is even more difficult for sailors. From the fortunate site of Byzantium, which is Istanbul, or as we Greeks like to say, Constantinople here, up to the Black Sea, the Bosporus combines a similar flow of multiple currents of differing temperatures, but with potentially even more fierce winds off the very large Black Sea, and in addition, 2 45-degree angles here as you go up to the Black Sea, in the coastline that you have to negotiate. The currents get up to 7 to 8 knots. Alfonso Moreno has collected all of the literary and epigraphical evidence for a prominent sanctuary near the mouth of the Bosporus, called by the ancient authors simply Hieron. He locates it at Kavak Point, commanding the modern Makar Bay, known as the harbor of Phrixus in antiquity. Today, the height is crowned with the remains of a Byzantine fortification, although there are some ancient spolia, ancient blocks built into the walls. Originally dedicated to Poseidon and the 12 gods, and also Artemis in the early Archaic period, the sanctuary served as a collecting point for offerings from mariners for more than 1,000 years. As Moreno shows, it was also a pontic malarium, a repository for interstate treaties, and a marshalling point for grain fleets. By the Roman period, it lost its asilia, or inviolability, and the sanctuary seems to have been thought of as dedicated to Zeus Oreos. Pindar in Pythian Ode 4 describes its founding by Jason. Quote, "Sped by the breezes of the south wind, they come to the mouth of the inhospitable sea, where they established a sacred precinct for Poseidon of the sea. And there was at hand a tawny herd of Thracian bulls, and a newly built stone altar with a hollow. Rushing now into deep danger, they prayed to the Lord of the ships for escape from the irresistible movement of the clashing rocks. for both were alive and would roll more swiftly than the ranks of loudly roaring winds. But that voyage of demigods finally brought their end. End quote. The site of Haran offers a wide view up to the Black Sea and down towards Istanbul. We shift now to the westward outlook from Athens. From the early Archaic period onward, the waterway was thought of as the Gulf of Corinth, going from Corinth here to the west, and was commanded by Corinth. The isthmus offers a shortcut for portage and cabotage, which well, there was a road there for dragging cargo to avoid the risk, time, and expense of going down around Cape Malias. When the Athenians expanded their maritime power in the course of the 5th century BC, they wanted to take control of the Gulf. At the farthest end, at Enidai, Enidai, just beyond Messalongi, the former semi-insular polis is now a hill with its beautifully built ship sheds quite landlocked due to the silting power of the Achelous River. Thucydides describes Athenian attacks in the 5th century, with one venture led against it by Pericles himself. This mark of its strategic importance would continue to make it contested well into the Hellenistic period. Within the Gulf of Corinth, the narrowest point is at Rhion, Ante-Rhion, or Malicarian Rhion, you see there. That served as the same sort of barrier and gateway we've seen at Geristos, the Hellespont, and the Bosporus. A temple of Poseidon was built in Malicarion, with a likely related sanctuary also on the point of land itself at Malicarion Rhion, that's down by the water, as it was called by Thucydides. The actual coastline has changed considerably since antiquity. Not only has there been silting and earthquakes, but the Gulf is even now expanding by 30 millimeters per year, a constant change that posed challenges to the engineers of the new Rhion-Anti-Rhion Bridge. Any remains of the seaside sanctuary at Malicarion Rhion would have shifted well out of access. The town of Pelike, which is now Pactus on the map, which included the site of the sanctuary of Laconian Poseidon, was swallowed up by an earthquake in 373 BC. The town completely disappeared into a newly created lagoon. Recent exploration of the area has identified the site under alluvial fill. Ancient authors speculated about why Pelike was swallowed up, and they concluded that a god was offended by some misdeeds of the townspeople. The terrifying disappearance of Pelike can be invoked for a variety of moralizing conclusions, just like this destruction of Pompeii. In 429, the Athenian general Phormio led ships in a brilliant victory over a much larger Peloponnesian fleet, described in detail by Thucydides. With only 20 ships, Phormio and his crews were able to defeat a fleet of 66. At first it seemed impossible for the Athenians, and one of their ships was definitively lost. That lone ship was dedicated later by the defeated Peloponnesians at Rhion, on the other side, as a marker of their temporary victory, which they considered impressive enough. They set up the usual trophy too, Thucydides reports in a somewhat sniffy tone. But in the end, the Athenians won thanks to a brilliant stratagem and splendid handling of the ships. Like the much later naval victory of Venice in Spain over the Ottomans in 1571, which took place nearby, that was the Battle of Lepanto, the larger significance of the battle was that control of the seas was at least psychologically all for Athens. Both sides recognized this. The Athenians dedicated a whole ship captured from the enemy at Malicarion Rhion at a sanctuary of Poseidon. In this, they recalled those communal dedications of the Greeks of whole Phoenician ships made after Salamis at Isthmia, Sunion, and Salamis. Actual temples to Poseidon are not common in this part of Greece, known as Aetolia, but at Malicarion, a large hexastyle temple was constructed in the early to mid-4th century BC, in plan, design, and detail somewhat similar to those for Artemis at Calydon and Zeus at Stratos. Since Molycrion was famed for its cult of Poseidon, it is assumed that the large temple at the site, whose steps are visible at the crest of the hill, was dedicated to him. One specifically Poseidonian feature of the sanctuary is the spectacular view it commands. To the west is the Gulf of Patras. To the east, the view reaches as far as Corinth on a clear day, but for a stand of trees, the view south would be like this one, taken some 5 kilometers south of the ancient site. The whole panorama of the Gulfs of Corinth and Patras are spread before us. In sum, we see from the few examples I have discussed, maybe I should put this on yet, of the 175 attested temple promontories, that Poseidon's network of temples supported, encouraged, and nurtured maritime traffic. The temples marked difficult passages and gave additional visibility to an often treacherous coastline. Although nothing could be done about the winds except to sit them out, as Odysseus himself learned, some temples provided refuge from both actual winds and political storms. Odysseus was advised by Tiresias to travel with an oar on his shoulder until he was among people who didn't recognize it as an oar, but thought it was a winnowing fan. He was then to offer a large sacrifice of a ram, a bull, and a boar to Poseidon. This passage, with the idea of traveling until an oar is unrecognized, has inspired many interpretations in antiquity and today. To me, the sacrifice to Poseidon suggests that all lands are affected by the sea, and it represents an acknowledgement of Poseidon's very large realm, even embracing those belonging to people ignorant of the power of the sea. It is rather like the satellite view of Earth, with oceans so prominent. I suppose we could even read an environmental warning into this passage. I hope to have shown you this morning that while the placement of Greek temples is not really an answerable question, it does bear examination. I'd be happy to answer questions on the first paper. Yes? Oh.
I have a question about the fish and the dolphins.
Mm-hmm.
A question about the fish and the dolphins. The fish are depicted usually so accurately that yet you can identify the species. The dolphins are depicted with a vertical tail, but I think dolphins and whales have horizontal tails. I wonder if there's a reason for that.
I'm afraid I'm not an ichthyologist and I haven't looked into that. I think after a while, dolphins just become art dolphins, you know, and these people have never really seen dolphins in the sea. Most of the Greeks, you know, but vase painters probably particularly didn't go out to sea. So that may account for that inaccuracy. I'll have to look that up. They really weren't that accurate until they got to the 4th century when they did the fish plates that you see upstairs, and then they were very interested in the different species. And this was because of the, gourmet cuisine. You know, people even had fish farms where they raised fish as prize fish. In some sanctuaries, fish are given jewels to wear. So they were, that's when they really got very interested in the different species. Yeah, student there, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, why are there so few images of the fishing nets? Was that just not a common way for them to fish? Or could you elaborate on that? I was surprised that you said there weren't really very many images on the pottery of the fishing nets.
I had a hard time finding anyone, and there's I think a Norwegian scholar who's written about fish nets in antiquity. We find the weights quite commonly, and even they can be dedicated in sanctuaries, like fish hooks, weights, anything to dealing with fish. But of course, the nets themselves were made out of some organic material that doesn't survive, and I guess they went out to sea, and again, vase painters or illustrators didn't show the nets. I think we have a net scene actually in Etruscan art, but it's pretty rare. Yeah.
There's another one.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I want to follow up on the dolphin thing. Melville might be a place to go and look. I think he has like 5 chapters on, fish and
Oh, yeah, I've
images
read it.
in
Long
Moby
time
Dick. And Jenifer, I like the way that you called them dolphin fish too, at one point, which is kind of that confusion Melville is dealing with. And did they eat dolphins? And then I also want to follow up with that cute little seal.
I know.
Did they eat the dolphins and seals? Do we have evidence?
There's not much evidence for eating dolphins, and dolphins were friends of mankind. Of course, there are these stories of heroes who were given rides and saved, taken across the sea. We have many sculptures of dolphin riders. There's one in the show, isn't there? There's the base of one in the show. So I think they were on much friendlier terms with dolphins. It's odd. I think it changes over time, but in Homer, no one eats fish. They only eat meat, and only under duress would they eat fish. And there's been a lot of discussion of that in Homeric studies, and one of the conclusions is, well, fish eat humans that die at sea, so you could be eating, you wouldn't eat a fish because it might have eaten your brother, is the idea. So, it changes, but I think they always had very good feelings about dolphins because, of course, they travel with ships and they don't eat fish. They don't. Maybe they do eat fish. Dolphins do eat fish, but anyway, they're mammals, so I think they felt differently about them. Jerry?
Is it an accurate perception from just the pictures you showed that shipwrecks are more commonly depicted in the late geometric period than they are in the archaic period? And why should that be so?
Well, because I think he's asking why are shipwrecks only depicted. There are only a couple of them, and they're in the geometric period. And this is the first time when they're venturing out. In the 750 BC, they're colonizing southern Italy and Sicily and going on these, which would at that time would have been fairly treacherous voyages. And I think as time went on, this became pretty routine, sailing to the west. But it was a novelty probably then, more of a novelty. And we have what do we have? Scenes in geometric art. It's warfare. It's naval battles. It's ship scenes. It's funerals. It's the repertoire isn't very huge at that point. But it's interesting that they depict these, and particularly cannibalistic fish. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, you showed a vase on the right that had a woman, I think it was from Sicily, who was throwing water on fish, and you interpreted that as being comical. And I was wondering if you could say, I think you explained by saying that there's a literary source that says that you're not supposed to do that because you're trying to hide fish not being fresh. But unless you do that, you wouldn't have fresh fish.
I know.
Which is why I think that's, you see, in the Mediterranean today, they're throwing all these, they do it at the co-op when they do it vegetables.
I know. Well, right. I was surprised but there was it was this idea that you were making the fish look fresher, than in fact was. So I think it was a law, not a passage. And the reason I think
to
that's,
not do it.
Yeah, I think it's comic because it's a satyr who's butchering the fish. The man standing at the side is a satyr, not a human.
So it's a woman and a satyr.
Yeah, a woman and a satyr, and I can try to find that passage, but it is surprising because, of course, yes, you need to put water on the fish, unless they sold them so quickly, that no, they were gone in half an hour or something. They didn't sit around in the market very long. There's a question at the back down there. Oh.
You noted a shift in the representation of sea creatures from the geometric period to later representations in black and red figure art, with sea creatures being man-eating, and I was wondering if there was the same shift with the representations of perhaps accidents at sea, whereas like a shipwreck with that, or if it changed individually.
Well, ship scenes, we have someone here who wrote a dissertation, who wrote a senior paper on ship scenes. They're pretty rare to begin with, and so I had to dredge up those two that show punishments at sea, which I think is the next sort of phase of, dangers of sea, not crashing and capsizing your ship, but maybe doing something bad on board and then having to be punished by being shoved overboard as punishment, because the Greeks were terrified of drowning. We don't know whether they don't seem to have been swimmers, and they were terrified of death by sea because they wouldn't have a ritual burial. Their soul would float around forever and they would never be properly buried. So they were always, the sea was always scary from that point of view. But they just change. I think there's still the challenges of the sea, but they're just shown in a different way later on. You have scenes, I didn't show mythological scenes. You have Odysseus and the Sirens, for instance. That's a hazard at sea. You're going to crash your ship on the shore if you listen to the song of the Sirens. Or a whirlpool. The Charybdis is a whirlpool. That's hard to depict in art, so it isn't depicted, but it exists, and it's both a mythological aspect of the Odyssey, but it's also real there in the Straits of Messina between Sicily and southern Italy.
William Murray is the Marion Gus Stathis Professor of Greek History at the University of South Florida, where he was the founding director of the university's Interdisciplinary Center for Hellenic Studies. He has served as the chair of the Department of History and currently serves as the director of the department's Ancient Studies Center. He has also taught as a visiting scholar at the University of Haifa and at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and he was selected as a national lecturer by the Archaeological Institute of America for, I believe, 9 years running, when he held the Institute's Charles Eliot Norton Lectureship. He was selected by the Onassis Foundation to write the first volume for their series, Studies in Hellenic Culture, and to participate in their university seminar program as a distinguished lecturer. His scholarly interests embrace all aspects of ancient seafaring, from ships and sailing routes to trade and ancient harbors, to naval warfare and weaponry. In pursuit of these interests over the past 30 years, he has been involved in numerous archaeological projects in Greece, Israel, and Turkey, both on land and in the water. He is the author of The Age of Titans, The Rise and Fall of the Great Hellenistic Navies, published by Oxford University Press, and is currently working with Konstantinos Zachos from the Greek Ministry of Culture to recreate full-sized warship rams from the Battle of Actium. The last project relies on analyzing Augustus's victory monument for the Actian War with 3D laser scans and computer modeling techniques. He is going to speak with us on the topic Poseidon's Realm, Ancient Naval Warfare. Sarah Murray will follow him. She's an assistant professor of classics and religious studies at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. She's also one of our alumni, an 04 who graduated cum laude with a major in classical archaeology, after which she went on to do a post-bac certificate at the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD at Stanford. Her primary research focus is the collapse of Mycenaean civilization at the end of the Late Bronze Age, the ensuing aftermath in the early Iron Age, and how that aftermath eventually transformed into historical Greek society. She's done extensive archaeological work in the US and Italy, as well as in Greece, where she's worked at Mitrou, Iosotira, Korphos, Plakias, and Oinoi for an extraordinary range of different types of projects, including both excavations and intensive field surveys. Her current project, entitled Digital Dark Ages, seeks to shed new light on the precise cadence of this episode of a prototypical collapse and regeneration of complex society, using a big data approach to the sum total of the relevant material evidence. This digital project is designed to dovetail with the imminent publication of her dissertation on change in the Greek economy between 1300 and 900 BCE. Other areas in which she has scholarly interests and has published include the integration of GIS in archaeological field project data management systems, Greek athletics, the intersection of religion and ancient society, and British travel in 18th century Sicily. She will speak to us today on Poseidon, Earthshaker, the frightful sea as friend and foe in early Greece. Please join us in welcoming our speakers this morning.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Although I feel like I should be Sarah and not, since she was last, but that's okay. I too would like to thank the organizers of this event, which has given me a chance to come to Dartmouth for the first time. I was actually accepted to come to Dartmouth as an undergraduate, but then my parents told me how much more cheap it would be for me to go to Penn State. So I went to Penn State and never really knew what I missed until I came here and started looking around and talking with some of the faculty here. This is an extraordinary place, and those of you who are here are lucky to be here. I'd like to thank Kathy Hart and Sharon Reed, who was my point of contact for all of the logistical details regarding my visit. And of course, to my colleague Seth Pevnick, I cannot express to him how nice it has been to have him in Tampa, not very far away, about 9 miles away at the Tampa Museum of Art, and my students and I have benefited very much from his being there. And I thank him as well for asking me to join in this enterprise. Let's start off by talking about some basic principles before we talk about naval warfare. Just keep this in mind throughout my remarks. Navies are really expensive. And as a result of that, there's a reluctance on the part of states and individuals to really develop a high-class navy. True naval power requires a standing navy where you invest long-term in naval vessels that are only good for fighting, that are not good for other things like trading, and I call them single-purpose warships. And so most Mediterranean powers tried to find ways to avoid building a standing navy because of its expense, if their objectives could be secured in other ways. And this continues throughout antiquity. Technology, as today, does make a big difference, but it too is expensive and as a result is ephemeral. It does not last long. The Navy is secondary in importance to the Army, and I could talk at length about that, but I don't have time to do so, so just keep it in mind. The Navy is of secondary importance. No matter how much the midshipmen would like to think otherwise, it's that way. From the earliest times, men prayed to Poseidon for good weather and safe passage across his waters. Everybody knew the sea was a dangerous place where death could come in terrible ways that denied one the funeral rites of settled life, as we have heard. Despite this fact, the course of Mediterranean history involved people who traveled extensively by sea and intermingled, dare I say, jostled with one another. And those who mastered the sea had an edge over those who didn't in this jostling process. This is not to say that sea power, or the ability to control who had access to the sea, was a prerequisite for greatness, but more often than not, the major Mediterranean powers built and maintained navies which they used to further their interests in various ways. Up until the 6th century, the navies of most states were almost amateur in nature, gathered together in an ad hoc manner when the need arose. The ships that were pressed into service were dual-purpose vessels owned by wealthy elites who used them both for raiding and for trading purposes. This model is clearly seen in the ships brought by the Achaean grandees to Troy when Agamemnon made the rounds and called on his friends to come with both ships and men to avenge the dishonor to his family. And although I can't prove it, I bet the same system lay behind the Thera flotilla seen at the top of the 7th century West House frescoes and the Sea People's fleet that attacked the Nile Delta more than 4 centuries later. Such oared ships, which we call galleys, still carried no rams at their prows. The projection that you see here reduced hull drag and made the ship easier to row. I call it a forefoot. These kinds of ships were used primarily for ferrying soldiers from place to place, although men could and did fight with one another from the decks, with projectile weapons and long spears, as seen on this cup from Eleusis and this 7th century crater from Caira in Etruria, which is now in the Capitoline Museum. You can see from this 8th century example that the ships were long and narrow, roughly 7 times longer than they were wide. We've already heard how difficult they are to represent on pottery. And they required numerous oarsmen to propel them. I've shown you the ship this way because it wraps around the vase and it's very difficult to get a picture side on that shows you the vessel. From names that survive in literature, we can see that the favorite ones came in 20, 30, and 50 oar sizes. The 50 oar size obviously being longer than the 20 oar size. They all had limited room for cargo because the oarsmen took up so much room inside the vessel, and so these ships were poorly suited for bulk carrying cargo like grain or wine. They were better suited for fetching luxury items like metals or ivory, where your crew could serve as a security force. They were also good for raiding the same luxury items, and this time your crews could serve as pirates. Around 700, we think we detect the beginnings of an important structural change from images like this relief at Sennacherib's palace at Kuyunjik, Nineveh. Here, the subject is a naval evacuation of Tyre in the face of an Assyrian onslaught led by Sennacherib. The ship's forefoot, seen here, right there, that's the forefoot, and note the collar, which is pointed out right there, appears to be sheathed in metal, presumably to protect it from damage when ships fought prow to prow and bumped into one another. Now, I don't mean they're bumping, they're ramming into one another, they're literally lying alongside one another, prow to prow. In other words, none of these projections are yet rams that you see on this slide that were built to extend the hull timbers of the vessel and to serve as the foundation for purposeful offensive blows. By 550 or so, this forefoot had finally become a ram, which was sturdy enough to withstand purposeful collisions with other warships. Herodotus provides the clue when he tells us how the Greek Phocians from Western Asia Minor established a colony on Corsica called Alalia. They used this place as a base for piracy, which so angered the neighbors, the Carthaginians and the Etruscans, that they joined together to drive the Phocians from the area. In a sea battle fought off Alalia, the Phocians found themselves outnumbered 2 to 1, but they unexpectedly won. Although, Herodotus tells us, their rams, and this is the first time he uses the word, were dislocated from the fighting. And he uses a particular participle to describe the dislocation, which is sort of a hapax. It's not used anywhere else. About this same time, the best warships increased in size from 50 to 170 oarsmen. The first to build a large fleet of these new galleys, called triremes, was the Persian king Cambyses, who did so just before his successful attack on Egypt in 525 BC. These new ships were so much more expensive than the old-style galleys and were crewed by 85 men per side who sat at 3 different levels in triads that repeated themselves down the side of the vessel. There's one of the triads there, and there's another one there, and there's another one there. And you can see there's a triad there, there's a triad there. The lines run through the center lines of their heads. And although the lowest oar is in there, and you're just seeing the tip of it, the triads are repeated down the side of the vessel there as well. The hulls were no longer held together by stitching, but by interlocking joinery called mortison's tenons, with the end result that the hulls were both strong and flexible. In many ways, Cambyses' use of the trireme in large numbers was a real game changer. The new vessels were too big and too expensive to serve as private merchant galleys, So henceforth, only states with recurring revenues could afford them. Furthermore, the new warships were built to the same specifications, so they sailed at the same speeds with one another. They turned in the same predictable radii. They also had interchangeable parts so that the masts, oars, sails, boat poles, screens, and other equipment from one ship could be repurposed and put on another ship in the same fleet. After the reign of Cambyses, the old ad hoc system of warships was dead. And by the time of Xerxes' invasion to Greece in 480 BC, the major Greek cities had switched to triremes. Thanks to Thucydides, the historian of the Peloponnesian War, and himself a trireme commander, we know something about trireme warfare. We know, for example, that in the hands of an Athenian crew and commander, the vessel was a fearsome weapon that accelerated quickly, turned on a dime, worked well in squadrons of 10 or 20 ships, and delivered bone-jarring strikes that put their enemies out of action. While the Athenians mastered trireme warfare, other Greeks still fought in a way Thucydides calls old style, where the ships served as floating platforms for infantrymen and archers to have a go at one another. But in the hands of an Athenian oar crew, the entire vessel becomes a weapon, with helmsmen and rowers working together to outmaneuver their enemies and strike them in their sides, as you see here in this modern reconstructed drawing. Thucydides repeats what an expert trireme commander named Phormio told his men before an engagement at the entrance to the Corinthian Gulf. And we saw a picture of the very place where this occurred in Margie Miles's talk, the last talk. This occurred during the early years of the Peloponnesian War. And he says to his men, in a contest between a number of clumsily managed vessels, meaning the enemy, and a small, fast, well-handled squadron, meaning his crews, want of sea room is a decided disadvantage. It's a double negative. You want to have lots of room. One can't run down the enemy properly without catching a sight of him a good way off. Nor can one back up and disengage when pressed. One can neither break through the enemy line, turn around, and return upon the rear of the enemy ships, which are the proper tactics for a well-handled, fast-sailing ship. But the naval action necessarily becomes a land one, in which numbers determine who's the victor. My advice to you is to stay at your posts, keep quiet, and be sharp at catching the word of command. Remember that silence is an important quality in all naval engagements. In the battle that followed, the Athenians, ever disciplined, quiet, and silent, used their speed and maneuverability to defeat a Peloponnesian force that outnumbered them by more than 2-1. At the time of Thucydides, the author of that bit, the price tag for such a fleet that could do this was considerable. If it took 60 pounds of silver to build a ship, it took an equal amount each month to crew it, and a further 60 pounds each year to cover the annual repair bill for breakage and wear and tear on the equipment. There was more. Light wooden warships were extremely susceptible to a wood-eating mollusk called Teredo navalis, which rendered the hulls unseaworthy in a single season without proper care. For this reason, the Athenians stored their warships in ship houses, each with a stone slipway and a tile roof supported on columns. Hundreds of covered slipways were built in the war harbors of Athens, located at Piraeus, at a cost second only to the entire city wall surrounding the city of Athens. In these harbors, the Athenians had their naval yards, their construction and maintenance facilities, their warehouses for ship's gear, and all the bean counters who kept track of everything, as we know from a series of inventory inscriptions that you see here, which tell us about the Athenian navy in the period from the 370s to the 320s. Following the 5th century, through the 4th and into the 3rd, warships increased further in size, bigger than the triremes, carrying some more than 1,000 men, with large decks for holding catapults, assault bridges, boarding, bridges, and other kinds of siege machinery. These vessels, the larger ones, were called megaloskophe by the Greeks, literally meaning big ships, while we modern scholars tend to refer to them as polyremes. It comes from a sort of bastardized Greek noun that describes them in late antiquity. The result was the creation of a 4, and then a 5, and then a 6. So a trireme is a 3, a triares. A 4 is a tetrares. A 5 is a pentares, and so forth. And the result is a different oar system that is used. And in this oar system, we don't have triads anymore. We have groups of 4, and then groups of 5, and groups of 6 that repeat in repeatable ways down along the side of the hull. So here you see, this is the one that we think a 4 actually is. It's a 2-level galley. It's a 2-level galley in which you have 2 men per oar. A 5 would then be perhaps a 2-level galley with 3 men per oar on the lower oar and 2 men per oar on the lower oar and 3 men per oar on the upper oar, and so forth. The ships get to be insanely large, as we'll find out. Here is an image of what one of these larger galleys looked like. This may be a 4, or it may be a 5, or it may even be a 6. You can see that it has a deck tower at the bow, fitted with emplacements right there for catapults. Increases in size meant decreases in speed and maneuverability, but it also meant more ramming power and greater deck space. Alexander proved how useful these factors could be when he attacked the island city of Tyre in 332 BCE. By mounting catapults and other siege machinery on their decks, he took a likely 2-year siege and completed it in 1/4 the time. It had a terrible impact on people at the end of the 4th century. The Romans loved these bigger ships for their wider decks, which they packed with marines and rigged at times with boarding bridges to negate the ship handling skills of their foes, particularly during the First Punic War with the Carthaginians. As we've seen, all these larger ships were powered by multiple manned oars placed at 1, 2, or 3 levels, and the oar crew was completely enclosed by a covered fighting deck. And this gives rise to another noun which is used to describe these warships. They were called cataphract galleys, or decked galleys, or closed-in galleys. In general, the largest of these big ships were used for attacking coastal cities, for breaking through harbor chains, for pulling out siege machinery and going at harbor fortification walls. And only the wealthiest of the states following Alexander the Great could afford them. States like Ptolemaic Egypt or Antigonid Macedonia. During the 4th and 3rd centuries, ships like 8s, 10s, 20s, 30s, and even a gigantic 40 was built. The 40 was so big that its overall specifications were preserved, and they're fantastic. So we'll take a look at them very briefly here. The entire ship is 420 feet long. So keep in mind that length when you watch the Super Bowl. The total crew, this is the other thing, is more than that on a modern aircraft carrier. 7,250 men. Now, people always ask me, did it work well? And the answer was no, it didn't work well. As a matter of fact, it was dangerous to take it away from its special cradled launching facility, which is here. There have been various attempts to explain how it was constructed. It was a multi-hulled galley, and whether or not it's like this, with 2 hulls separated by a wide deck, as hypothesized by Lionel Casson, or whether it's something more bizarre. I like this. This is truly bizarre. But I do like this for reasons that I don't really have time to go into. But this was a monstrous thing that probably served or was intended to serve as a showpiece. But the smaller 30 was clearly utilized as a mobile siege or a floating siege tower base. We have no images of ships smaller than the 40s, like the 8s, the 9s, or the 10s that served in real fleets. but we can gain a sense of their relative sizes if we look at the sizes of their rams, which also got larger. In 31 BC, Octavian defeated the fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, and a year or two later built a massive monument to commemorate the event. In a long retaining wall, he displayed a tithe of warship rams he stripped from the largest ships he captured. And these were 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, and 5s, and maybe even some 4s. The rams are long gone, but holes remain. That's not strictly true. 1 6-kilo fragment of a ram remained, but the rest of them are gone. Holes only remaining that once received the rams, and the holes themselves are sunk 50 centimeters into the face of the stone. Using 3D scanning technology, we have reverse engineered the rams that were displayed here to give you an idea of their relative sizes. And you're looking at our reverse engineered rams from the front view. The numbers underneath each one of the models indicates the relative placement of the hole along the front of the facade and not the ship size. The ship size of the largest one on the left is probably a 10 or a deck K race, and the one on the right side, 22, is probably either a 6 or a 5. And what I have on the far right is actually an authentic example of a ram called the Athlete ram, weighing 1,028 pounds, that was pulled off the seafloor south of Haifa in 1980. It's a baby, and when it came up, we thought it was big. And when you compare it to these monumental holes at Actium, it turns out they're much, much bigger still. In the simplest terms, these rams suggest that the difference between a 10 and a 3 was so much that if a 10 met a 3 in battle, it would literally drive right over it with a little bump, and you would barely notice it, except if you were on the 3, of course. While 3s could run rings around 10s in terms of speed and maneuverability, they were extremely vulnerable in the prow-to-prow charges that opened all naval battles of the 4th, the 3rd, and the 2nd, and the 1st centuries BC. In 306, when Demetrius fought Ptolemy off Cyprian Salamis, the battle began with both fleets lining up opposite one another like the two front lines of an American football team. The conflict started when one side raised a golden shield up the mast, and trumpets sounded the charge in relays up and down the line. The fleets were initially about 500 meters apart, we're told 7 stades, when they started to row pell-mell toward each other's bows. This meant that the helmsman had roughly 100 seconds to size up the enemy, pick out a ship that they were going to go for, and direct where they were going to move their own ram. And while the oarsmen below deck pulled with zeal, above deck, the archers, slingers, javelineers, and catapult crews unleashed hellacious volleys of darts, bullets, and stones in flurries like the snow we've had recently. Just before the moment of impact, everybody on deck knew that they had better crouch down and hold on for dear life. We hear of unprepared soldiers being ejected from deck towers out into the sea, helmsmen who have been ripped from their hold on the steering oar and thrown overboard by the force of the collision. And then, once the senses cleared, a bow team assessed the damage and relayed orders back to stand fast or back up for another charge. And so the battle continued. With modern technology like 3D sonars, underwater robots, and GPS positioning systems, we're now finding ancient battle sites. The one I have in mind is located off western Sicily, at a place where the last battle of the First Punic War was fought between Rome and Carthage. The red arrow represents the Romans moving out from Favignana Island, a big tuna center, by the way, to intercept a Carthaginian fleet coming from Maritimo Island, called the Sacred Island. They were trying to extend that blue arrow toward the coast of Sicily that you see on the right-hand side of the map. They never made it. They were intercepted in rough seas, and the ships were sent to the bottom, to be found by us today. Here, we're finding fallout from the conflict, like battle-scarred rams, helmets, and amphoras that once held the badly needed relief supplies for an entire garrison located ashore. Aside from the helmets, which are such a personal item that they really speak to me when I see them, I'm also moved by the eloquent testimony of these split and dented rams that came from conflicts whose details are lost. We can only recover them by looking at the damage to the weapons involved. It brings us back to the fact that with slight variations from place to place, naval warfare involved large gangs of men from working class backgrounds who sweated below decks and were protected by Marines who would rather be serving ashore in the hoplite infantry or Roman legions. No wonder. It was all tough work, which involved a high degree of boredom, punctuated by hot, sweaty work, periods of occasional extreme danger, and it was not completely pleasant. All major Mediterranean states had navies, and everybody at sea prayed to their gods, as is shown by the short inscription to Baal or Tanit, depending upon your reading of the text, cast into the surface of this Punic ram. I don't know whether you can make out the scratchings there. I imagine that Poseidon and Neptune received their fair share of requests for safety as well. We still have a lot to learn about the nature of ancient naval warfare, the ships involved, how they changed over time, the forces they generated, and the ways they were used. New material is becoming available all the time, thankfully, along with new techniques that we can utilize for readdressing what we thought we once knew and the artifacts that we thought we once understood. This exhibit, Poseidon in the Sea, gives us an opportunity to see things we've never seen before. I put two of my favorites up here. And to rethink our notions of the sea's importance to those who populated the Mediterranean's shores and islands. I find it a fun exercise, and I want to thank the organizers for giving me a chance to participate in it. Thank you very much.
All right, so I just want to start, of course, by adding to the chorus of gratitude to just say thank you to Seth Pevnick for organizing this fantastic exhibition, to Kathy Hart for inviting me to come speak here and gathering this great panel of speakers who've given me tough acts to follow, and also to Sharon Reed, who organized travel in the face of an impending snowmageddon. Of course, for me, it's very meaningful and a great honor to be back here at Dartmouth now in the role of a speaker. I started here as a tiny baby classicist, starting my major here at Dartmouth in 2001. I came from a small town in Appalachia where I'd never even heard of classics. So, of course, I never could have come to a place where I'm now official grown-up classicist without the support of the great classics department here at Dartmouth. And so I, of course, owe them an eternal debt of gratitude for helping me to have a life that I think is really great. So with no further ado, as we're running a little behind, I will speak to you today about Earthshaker, the frightful sea as friend and foe in Greek life through time. As often when it comes to the natural phenomena under the care of various Greek gods, Poseidon's realm, the sea, has a complex and varied place in the human imagination. The sea can be calm and serene, a source of rich harvests, and also a conduit to adventure, wealth, and glory. On the other hand, the sea has a dark side too. It can be unpredictable in terms of the weather, full of terrifying creatures that appear out of nowhere, and a good place to seek out the dreaded watery grave where one is deprived of an official burial, as mentioned several times already today. Much like the sea over which Poseidon had domain, this god could likewise be a friend or a foe to the ancient Greeks. Which one, friend or foe, would naturally depend on a variety of circumstances of time and space. So during the classical period of Greece, of course, as we know, the Greeks were very well acquainted with sailing and naval warfare, as we've just heard about. And as a result, what we see in classical Greece is, I would argue, a kind, gentle Poseidon that is your savior. But what I'll argue today is that this cozy relationship between Greeks, especially Athenians, and the sea god Poseidon is highly dissonant with the picture of Poseidon that we get in early Greece. This, I argue, is an attitude of outright terror, or at best deep ambivalence. So to make this point, I will start by taking a look at the demeanor of Poseidon in early Greek art and literature, so our earliest written literary evidence from ancient Greece, and also geometric art. I'll then show how this sort of sense of Poseidon as a terrifying creature seems to have dissipated through time, using artistic depictions of Poseidon, ships, and the sea as a proxy for changing attitudes toward Poseidon and the sea. And then finally, I'll offer some suggestions that might help us to explain this diachronic change in Greeks and their artists' perspectives on Poseidon and the sea over time. So as everyone knows, and as we just heard about, by the 5th century BC, the Athenians were the masters of the sea, right? This influential statesman Themistocles convinced the Athenians to take a big silver strike they got from Louvre and not to redistribute it amongst the citizens, but to spend it on building a really great navy, right? And the story of the classical period of Greece is one of Athens' great navy defeating all kinds of foes, right, and doing whatever they wanted. So the notion that we would have a friendly, nice guy, Poseidon, who's a savior rather than a foe in the 5th century context makes enough sense. But what I would argue is that this is a vision of a god in a certain chronological, social, and political climate, but it's not necessarily one that would have made sense to a Greek living in, say, the 8th century BC. Indeed, I think that if you went to the 8th century in Greece and you presented to them the idea that Poseidon should be your patron and your friend, they would look at you as though you had suggested that they adopt a pet Tyrannosaurus Rex. What is obvious from the archaeological and literary record is the fact that Poseidon was not a friendly figure in the Greek pantheon in those earliest days of Greek history. So let me foreground the visual evidence, which I'll show you in a little bit, with a survey of Poseidon's role in early Greek literature. So particularly we'll look at Homer, so probably from the 8th century BC, Hesiod, another poet in the Homeric tradition, probably dated to the late 8th or early 7th century, and then lyric poets, who are again a little later in the 7th century. In the Homeric poems, we know that in the Iliad, Poseidon doesn't play a great part. He's not the central focus of the poem. He only appears in a few places. Poseidon's most memorable moment in the Iliad is in regard to the building of the walls of Troy. The Greeks in the Trojan War are building a wall to protect themselves from the oncoming Trojan onslaught, but they haven't made the proper sacrifices to Poseidon first. So Poseidon objects to the building of the wall that will protect the Greeks. Zeus says, it's okay, Poseidon, we'll let them build the wall now, but eventually, you destroy everything, so you'll destroy it eventually. We also are reminded that Poseidon had earlier helped the Trojans to build their own walls, but because they didn't treat him with enough respect afterwards, he sent a nasty sea monster and destroyed the walls that he had originally helped to build. Now, more famously, of course, is Poseidon in the Odyssey. We know that Odysseus has a fight with Poseidon's son, Polyphemus, in Book 9 of the Odyssey. Odysseus, of course, tries to save his men by stabbing out Polyphemus' eyeball with a hot stake. This is successful, but he incurs the eternal wrath of Poseidon by doing so. So the story of the Odyssey is essentially one in which Poseidon continually besets Odysseus' attempts to get home in various nasty ways. These kind of events are common enough, right, in these early Greek myths. We can think of the Argonaut voyage in which Jason's boat has all these problems, again, usually at the hands of an angry Poseidon. Now, of course, all the gods in Homer are pretty capricious, right? They each have their own particular proclivities. We're not dealing with a pantheon of meritocratic just gods here. But I would point out that in the Odyssey, Poseidon is separated off from the gods as being particularly unjust and particularly full of wrath that cannot be contained, right? So here's a great line from the beginning of the Odyssey. All the gods pitied him, that is, pitied Odysseus and his attempt to get home, except Poseidon. But he continued to rage unendingly against Odysseus as he tried to get back home to his family. Now, so that's emphatic language in its own way, but we could also point out from the linguistic point of view, right, that nos phi Poseidanonos, right, this is the only time in the whole Homeric corpus in which nos phi, right, an except phrase appears at the beginning of a line. And Homer often does this, right, to particularly emphasize what he's saying there. Right? So Poseidon is being particularly removed from the general world of Greek gods and pointed out as particularly vengeful. It's no wonder then that Hesiod, right, who's a little later than Homer, he's writing a poem about how to go about your life as a rural Greek. So this is a poem of advice that works in days. It's no surprise that Hesiod has no interest in going to sea, right? So he has a section in his poem that's about advice for going to sea. A major theme of this section is, I don't like to go to sea, and you probably shouldn't do that much of it either. But if you do, here are some rules that you should follow so that you make sure you're on the good side of things. But even if you follow all the rules that I give you, if Poseidon feels like wrecking your ship and killing all the sailors, he'll do it. Right, so again, we see this consistent view of Poseidon as unreasonable and always causing a threat, right, to these people who are out sailing on the sea. This theme of Poseidon as particularly capricious and vengeful carries on to these later poems, the lyric poet tradition. This is Alcaius, a poet from Lesbos. He's writing at the end of the 7th century. And again, this guy is sort of obsessed with the idea of the sea being dangerous and ships being in great peril when they go onto it. Right, so a number of the fragments that we have left of this guy's poems, again, are about, the wave comes and it's going to give us trouble. Let's just go back into the harbor. Here's one in which he's personified the ship. So the ship doesn't even want to go out to sea and face the storms that Poseidon are going to bring there. And finally, a long description of, I'm out at sea, I don't understand what's going on, the waves are coming in all over the place, and we're helpful here in the middle of the great storm. Right, so this tradition that we see in Homer and Hesiod of Poseidon and the sea being these dangerous places and bringing bad things upon you are consistent, right, throughout almost all of this early Greek literary evidence. Now, all this literary evidence is just that, right? We always need to be cautious when interpreting what it means for the everyday life of the average person living in Greece based on what we see as themes in these poems. So just because Poseidon seems bad in the poems doesn't mean that everyone's terrified of actually going out to sea. For instance, we know that in this poem, these poems by Alcaius, right, he was exiled from Lesbos by an evil tyrant. And so he seems to be using the poetry of the storm, right, the bad things that happen to a ship in an unpleasant sea, as an analogy to what happens to a state when there's a ruler who doesn't care about its people and is ruling according to his whims. But even so, right, I would argue that for this analogy to have any force, right, for it to make sense, you should be afraid of an evil tyrant in the same way that you are afraid of a ship being in a storm at sea, right? That would have to be something that resonates deeply with people. Of course, where images of ships and seafaring are concerned, we get an iconography that's broadly consistent with this monstrous watery realm presented in the literary sources. Poseidon himself, like other gods of the pantheon, doesn't appear in an identifiable form in Greek art until the 6th century or so, but ships are very popular in Greek art of the 8th century. And as much as the literary record would lead us to expect, shipwrecks, right, as we've seen, are a major part of the early Greek iconographical repertoire. Right, so we've already seen these vessels, so I won't go through them in too much detail. Right, these are geometric depictions of shipwrecks with a guy getting his face eaten off by a shark. Again, this great oinakwe, which I've seen a few times already. Again, mayhem at sea. There are also many other fragments of a similar theme. Right, so ships in association with dead bodies, either just dead for some reason unrelated to the sea being dangerous, or perhaps these guys were also drowned, like the people in the previously shown depictions. The The general gist, though, I think is clear. When you go out on a ship in 8th and 7th century Greece, both the poets and the imagery agrees, you're in for trouble. So it's no surprise, right, that some of the earliest depictions of Poseidon himself, right, and his wife Amphitrite, they're not playful depictions of Poseidon on a sympathetic vessel that you might drink from while hanging out with your friends, but these are dedicatory plaques, right? These are plaques from a site called Pentascufia near the site of Isthmia, right, and they date, again, to the sort of end of this fraught relationship with the Poseidon period and the geometric period. And these are dedications, right? So effectively the force of these dedications is, I am giving this offering to Poseidon so that I don't end up having my face eaten off by a shark like those poor guys in the pottery. So given all this evidence, I would argue that what happens next in the late Archaic and Classical periods is quite a remarkable reversal in terms of Poseidon's relationship with those he rules over. The first development we see is, again, something that we've looked at again and again in this symposium is these black figure dinoi, right? So these are vessels where you put wine in, mix it with water, and use this as a sort of serving bowl for your symposium. And instead of ships in trouble at sea, ships in a storm, shipwrecks, ships with people dying nearby, we see ships just sailing calmly on the interior rim of this dinos in a way that does not belie any kind of distress or trouble. Now, in a way, this is a much more playful vision of what happens when you drink and what happens when you're at sea, right? So there's this literary trope that we see here embodied in the ceramic tradition. Being drunk is kind of like being on a ship in a storm, right? You don't know where you are, you walk a little funny, so on and so forth. Right, but again, we don't get this kind of existential fear that we see in the early tradition. It's a little more of a playful sense of, well, there's some things you want to be afraid of at sea, just like bad things can happen when you're drunk. But we're sort of being a little more sardonic about it here. If the late 6th century saw a lightening up of attitudes towards Poseidon's realm and art, the Athenian turn towards Poseidon in the 5th century took these attitudes several steps further. So the 5th century BC, Poseidon appears to have none of the sort of bile, choking back anger, rage of the Poseidon that we heard about in Odysseus' travels. We now have a softer, friendlier version of the god who performs exactly the opposite function of the old, nasty Poseidon of the geometric period. So this is the kind of Poseidon that you would allow to carry your young child around as a babysitter. In vase painting, right, so in the early part of the 5th century, we begin to see a close relationship between Theseus, who's sort of the symbol, poster child of the democracy, and Poseidon, right? And in fact, at this time, a new story about Theseus' life comes out. First of all, that his father is not this guy Aegeus, as was formerly believed, but that Theseus is actually descended from the sea god Poseidon. And a poet called Kylixes, right, wrote a poem that describes Theseus' visit home to see his father Poseidon. Right, so just to summarize the story, Theseus is going to Crete to slay the Minotaur. In this version of the story, King Minos is along for the ride. And he says, "Hey Theseus, I know you say that Poseidon is your dad, but I don't believe you. What I'm going to do is throw my ring into the ocean and challenge you to go get it. If you can get the ring, then I believe you that Poseidon is your father," right? So we get this whole story of Theseus visiting the sea, hanging out with his father, getting the ring back, and of course getting gifts, guest gifts from Amphitrite. So in the early classical period, right around 470 BC, we start seeing Theseus with his father Poseidon. We also see, again, illustrations of his visit to the bottom of the sea to consort with his new watery progenitors. Right in here, again, we see a vessel we've seen already once, Theseus at the bottom of the sea visiting with Amphitrite. In general, the Poseidon and the sense of his valence in the Greek world in the early 5th century is a much more human version of this god, right? He's not this monstrous guy who goes around causing shipwrecks and making your life at sea difficult. Rather, he is just another god, easy to placate, and one that you can make into your patron. The newly cozy attitude that the Athenians seem to have with Poseidon in the classical period echoes similar themes in literature. So now we're more likely to see Poseidon as a god who saves you from your fears rather than one who brings you more fears, as in this quote from Aeschylus here. There's also a great version of Poseidon's wrath told in Euripides' The Trojan Women, instead of Poseidon wanting to actively punish Odysseus, in this version of the story, Athena tells him that he should do it, right? So he has to be goaded into behaving like the Poseidon that we're used to from the 9th to the 7th century. But he doesn't want to, because he's not a nice guy now. So of course, we have this dramatic change, or I would argue what is a dramatic change in people's conceptions of the sea and the sea god Poseidon, what he can and can't do for you over time. So of course, what we want to do is try to explain why does this seeming change in mood happen over the course of geometric to classical Greece. And of course, the first thing to come to mind for anyone who knows Greek history is the historical context. So of course, we know that in 480, there were the Persian Wars, right? And the Greeks won all these great battles against the Persians. And we've already heard, right, that there are a number of shipwrecks which sort of ruined or weakened the Persian effort to conquer Greece. And we know, of course, from Herodotus that the Greeks made a direct connection between the storms that wrecked the Persian ships. They had Artemisian here in this quote from Herodotus, and Poseidon, right? After this happened, after Poseidon wrecked the Persian ships, they prayed to Poseidon as a savior. And from that day on, Poseidon is your savior. And again, we have in this show a great Vase, which is probably directly related to this event, right, which is Poseidon, again, looking very friendly and human, receiving libations from the goddess Nike, right, the goddess victory. So here, thank you, Poseidon, you helped us win this victory. There are a couple of, there are plenty of other instances of this kind of thing in the early 5th century in the context of the Persian Wars. So there's another Persian who's trying to attack a city called Potidea in northern Greece. While they're trying to cross over an isthmus to get to the city, there's a weird inundation that no one's ever seen that it's like before, and all the Persians die. And the ones who don't die because they can't swim get stabbed by the Potidaeans. And once again, we thank Poseidon for this episode. Those Persians didn't know that they should be nice to Poseidon, and so he punished them. But now he's on our side, right? He's no longer punishing us with this kind of thing. He's on our team in a way. Now, part of the new attitude toward Poseidon, I would say, in Greece in the 5th century is going to be a product of these historical events, right? That's clear enough. But there's also probably some element in which the Athenians and the Greeks in general are changing their attitude toward the sea as a product of their increased skill in being able to manipulate it, right? So as these guys get better trained at sailing, right, the technology improves so that they're less susceptible to Poseidon's whims, they're going to become less afraid of him. So we know, for instance, that the reason that the Greek ships at Artemisian didn't get wrecked like the Persians is that they knew what they were doing, right? They saw that the storm was coming, and so they went to a safe place, and they planned accordingly. So we may think of the new Poseidon as a sort of domesticated version of this old scary god. As you learn to control these scary forces that used to seem so monstrous to you, so they seem to be much gentler and much less of a threat to you. Now, finally, we want to integrate this general trend that I've pointed out in how Poseidon and his realm are depicted in imagery into a sort of bigger picture of Greek art. So I've sort of tried to argue that we have a progression of the sea as going from a very terrifying place to a place that can be sort of funny, right, in a sort of playful, sympathetic context, to a sort of more human thing, right? Poseidon as one of us, as a person that we can identify with. And I think that this is partly due to historical instance, but it's also part of a bigger trends in Greek art as a whole. Right, so if we look at how the Gorgon is portrayed over time, you could sort of follow a similar transition. Right? Originally, Gorgons appeared in a seriously scary way. They seem to be truly apotropaic, like we want to scare away the evil. Then in the Archaic period, right, you get a sort of sympathetic joke of when you finish drinking your glass of wine, you will see this scary face of a Gorgon. And maybe momentarily you will be like, but in the long run, right, this is not a dire threat to you. And then finally, right, we see a red figure, Medusa here on the right, who's not, in fact, scary at all, but she just sort of looks like a normal sleeping woman. Now, even though, right, we can see that the trends in depiction and probably perception of Poseidon do fit into some bigger veins in Greek thought and art, the combined evidence of the literary and the visual evidence probably suggests that there are a number of different things going on here all at once that cause this god to sort of adopt a new persona over time. So to conclude, while the Greeks often complained that their gods were fickle, right, that they would give one person one fate one day and then take it away the next, we might actually be able to turn that around. And so too were the Greeks' relationships with their gods, something that was contingent on social context and the world in which they were living. Right? So Poseidon may have felt the same way. Right? One day you think I'm evil, and the next day you think I'm your friend. And this is just one example. I think Poseidon's a great case of the sort of dynamism with which we should understand how Greek religion worked. Right? There were no rules, there was no code, there was no catechism. Right? The religion that the Greeks had sort of morphed and changed over time to fit the needs of that particular society. So this case of Poseidon, I think, is a great exhibition in that it underlies the complexity of both Poseidon's role in Greek religion and thought, but also it really reifies our bigger notion that religion and religious belief are fluid, dynamic entities that within some traditional structures change along with the prevailing winds of culture, politics, science, and art. So, thank you.
Okay, questions?
I had a question about the ships. It's hard for me to believe that one of these monsters could turn on a dime, as you said. And I would think a better way to disable the enemy would take a small, more maneuverable ship and wipe out the oars on one side. Was there evidence that there were special battle tactics other than ramming?
The answer to that question is turning on a dime. If you are, again, it's a replica, so we don't know exactly how the ship, the original ship turned. The replica can turn 180 degrees in less than 2 boat lengths. That's pretty good. And let's see, there is a very famous incident where the Athenian squadron of 20 ships is coming in. They've lost 9 ships on shore, 11 ships are left, and they're coming into the harbor at Naupactos. A ragged Peloponnesian fleet is chasing after them, hoping to catch the rest of the ships. The last ships that comes in from the Athenians does a quick turnaround about a merchant ship which is anchored at the entrance to the harbor at Naupactus, and in doing that turnabout so quickly manages to strike the side of the pursuing Peloponnesian ship and put it out of action. That so surprised the other ships coming up that they dropped their oars and lost way. And at that point, the Athenians exploded out of the positions that they were in by accelerating very quickly, recaptured all their 11 ships, and took some of the Peloponnesian ships to boot. So, this is Thucydides who describes it, and you're right, they're not turning on a dime, but they're really impressive and very agile and very quick. Your question about do you break the oars, and the answer is yes. And I don't think many of us understand how it's done, because how do you easily break oars without breaking your own oars as you come along the side of a ship? It's not a small oval ship that would come in. The warships themselves actually came in, we think, at perhaps a 45-degree angle, or maybe less, probably less, and then used a projecting timber at the bow called the epotis, which is the front of the rowing seat for the uppermost oars. And that probably snaps off the oars all along the line. The oarsmen along the side of the ship, which is toward the attacked ship, must feather their oars in along the side of their own vessel so that their oars are not damaged. And then the helmsmen and the oarsmen on the other side must adjust somehow so that the ship sort of goes bump, 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 banks along the side of the vessel, snapping off the oars. It's called parasirain or something like that. That's the verb that describes it. But yes, they did do that. And bigger ships did it, and bigger ships would do it, and smaller ships would do it. When attacked by bigger ships, they'd try and shoot the gap between big ships lined up side by side, hoping to take out the oars of one side. Good question.
Probably a simple question, but when and why do they row backwards? Besides the fact they don't want to see why they're going forward, but why do they row backwards?
If you've been on board any kind of ship where you're in, not a squadron, but you're in a formation with other ships around you, it's inevitable that you're going to, if you want to maintain your order and the line, that you'll have to back up at times. We will hear sometimes that entire fleets feel they're moving too close to the enemy, so in unison they will back up. At the Battle of Actium, Octavian told his men to back up as Antony's men started to advance out from the shore. There are a lot of different ways in which we think this backing maneuver was done. There is also a Greek verb that describes that. You would also back up after delivering a successful ram strike. So when your vessel, if your vessel had penetrated the enemy hull, you would then issue an order to back up, hopefully to pull your bow out of the hole that you had created in the enemy vessel, and then that way that would allow the two ships to disengage and not have the one ship impinge upon the other one.
I was actually asking why the oarman himself rows backward rather than rowing.
No, they're not rowing backwards. Yes, they are. They're facing backwards because what they do is they think about a rowboat. When you sit in a rowboat, you face toward the stern of a rowboat. And what you do is you put the oar in, and the oar is around a pin, and as you push forward, the oar moves toward the bow, if you're facing backwards. And then when you put the oar in the water, it pivots around the pin and moves toward the stern, and the resistance between the oar in the water and your pulling it forward actually pulls the ship forward through the water. So you have to face backwards in order to row correctly. It looks funny, you're right, but...
How much buoyancy did the rammed ship retain? I know that if the ships were too waterlogged, they would sink or lie very low in the water. But once a wooden ship is rammed, was it still buoyant? And if so, yes, it would be out of commission. But how would they finish it off? Would there then have to be boarding, grappling, and killing at that point, or?
Those are a whole bunch of questions sort of rolled into one. The ships that we're finding off the coast of Sicily, the warship rams, all have attachments in them that show the rams were not wrenched from their bow timbers. So those rams went down with portions of the ship attached. So the question is, how buoyant were the ships? The Athenian inventory lists tell us that when commanders lost their ship in storms, they could go before a court in Athens and plead, I want to be let off because of the storm. And the court could decide, yes, you're not liable for the ship, but it's interesting, they are still liable for the ram. And so either, I can't make any sense out of this other than if a ship is destroyed in a storm, it's still going to be floating out there, and you'd better go back out into the area and recover the ram, because you're still going to have to pay for it. There are many descriptions of naval battles where afterwards the ships are floating in the water. Sometimes the men will be put in the water, they'll swim over with hawsers, they'll tie them around the wrecks, and the wrecks will be towed back to shore, pumped out, and refitted. There are occasions when the ships are in the water, men are hanging onto the wreckage, and then the victors will sail in among the wreckage, collect their own casualties, save their own men, and kill the enemies. And for that, at least in Homeric times, we know they have a particular long spear called a boat spear, and they would use that for stabbing at the men who were in the water. So, does that answer everything?
I wonder if you could comment on the experimental ship built by the Greek Navy, the trireme, in the late 80s and the early 90s.
It's called Olympias. It's about 124 feet long, 16 feet wide. It weighs about 38 tons with everybody on board. Many scholars I know believe it's too heavy. I know that when the 2004 Olympics came and they were faced with refitting the vessel because it had rotted so badly that it needed to be reworked, that the naval architects that I talked to said there was no way that they could build it as light as it had been built before. We argue about it. Many people call it a floating hypothesis. I think that's the best way to refer to it, but it provides us, most everyone recognizes, with an excellent visual image that all of us use in any talk that we have about ships. And it provides us, those of us who read ancient texts and see pictures of ships on vases, with a great image to put in our mind's eye about what these things actually looked like. We can argue about the little bitty details. If you're really interested, there are a set of 4 studies that were done resulting from sea trials that cover the range from the 1980s. She was launched in 1986 or 1987. And they cover the 1980s, the early 1990s, and then a final sea trial around, I don't know whether it was in the early 2000s or not. But we've learned a lot about you take one vessel and you multiply it by 200, and the ways in which, for instance, the crew gets on board the vessel. If you multiply that by 200, it begins to make you understand the logistical problems involved that the Athenian commanders and crews solved in putting out war fleets that created the Athenian Empire and the burst of culture that we study in all these monuments and all these beautiful pieces of art. So it's been fantastically successful at focusing people's attention on this incredible accomplishment of the Athenians. So it's a great example of what I guess we would call today modern experimental archaeology.
And I think this might need to be our last question.
All right. So my question is for Sarah. Do you see much geographic variation in terms of representations of Poseidon? Maybe less seafaring societies have still more, frightening depictions of Poseidon, even into the classical and archaic periods, or?
Well, usually what happens is that societies that are, or say in Arcadia, for instance, which is inland, you still see Poseidon depicted again, but in those areas he's more associated with the horse, right? So he's Hippias Poseidon rather than sea Poseidon. So it's hard to make an argument about how they felt about Poseidon vis-a-vis the dangers of the sea, because I think they thought of him as a different god. Right, this is part of the problem with Poseidon, is that he has all these different guises, and like the horse thing, it seems to go way back into Indo-European times. Some association between the horse and rivers, or Poseidon having given birth to the horse. Beyond that, the problem is that most of the art we have, right, most of the vase painting is Athenian. And Poseidon doesn't really appear with great frequency outside of the Athenian tradition, as far as I'm aware. But there is some interesting variation geographically from Italy to Greece, for instance. So as Professor Niles was talking about, the Italians seem to be very interested in fish and these fish plates, and Poseidon appears there quite frequently. As far as Central Greece, Boeotian stuff, you don't see a lot of Poseidon there. So I think there is a huge amount of geographical variation. The problem for the really early stuff is we just don't have a huge amount of figural pottery outside of Athens that we can look to. And for my own research, I've mostly looked at the Athenian stuff. The literary tradition is interesting in that regard too, because a lot of the lyric poetry comes from East Greece, right? So this guy Alcaius, he's from Lesbos. A lot of people think that the Iliad and the Odyssey also come from an East Greek tradition. So we may be seeing simply that the archaic literary tradition is representing an attitude that was more prominent in the East, and in the later period we don't see that terror as much because we don't have that tradition anymore. An interesting question, I think.
Okay, I want to thank our speakers and thank everyone who has contributed to the symposium. And I imagine our speakers will be willing to take a few questions afterwards as well. Thank you.